The sound of distant gunfire had faded hours ago. Now, there was only silence. A thick, unnatural silence wrapped around the ruined battlefield like a burial shroud. The air was heavy with melted metal.
Of something worse, something sickly sweet and alien.
Captain Elias Voss stirred from the pile of rubble, coughing, his throat raw. He was alive. He blinked against the thick, red haze of the setting sun, taking in the destruction around him. Wrecked gunships smoldered in twisted heaps, their hulls still glowing. Dorgus Fav was lost. Elias knew the order had come. Full retreat. The fleet had pulled out, leaving the survivors behind. Or rather, what had been survivors. He should have been on that last dropship. A chittering whisper, almost delicate. His body froze. Slowly, he reached for the combat weapon strapped to his thigh, the only weapon left. His weapon was gone. All he had was this one, a growing certainty that he wasn't alone anymore. The whispering grew louder, clicking and sliding over itself, an alien cadence that made his skin crawl. His fingers tightened, his heartbeat hammered, sharpening his senses. And then, out of the twisted wreckage, something moved. A shadow peeled away from the ruins, its insectoid limbs clicking against the stone. It stretched over a too-long frame, its mouthparts glistening in the dim light. A Zerkal drone, scouting, searching, hunting. It hadn't seen him. Not yet. Elias did not breathe. The thing scuttled closer, head tilting in that eerie, twitching motion its kind always had. Its mandibles flexed, tasting the air, looking for anything still warm. He had exactly 3 options: run, fight, or pray it didn't notice. And Elias Voss had never been much of a praying man. With a slow, practiced motion, he slid the knife from its sheath, inching forward. Every nerve screamed at him to act before it could raise the alarm. But then, a sound was soft. His eyes flicked sideways, searching, scanning, and there, half buried beneath the broken hull of a dropship, he saw him. A figure bound, weak, and barely breathing. An alien. Elias recognized the markings immediately. Lieutenant Carrax, Dornathian military. The guy had been on his strike team earlier, leading a flanking maneuver before everything had gone to hell. He was still alive. But not for long. The Zerkal had stopped moving. Its mandibles flared, its head cocking toward the sound of that weak, struggling breath. It had found its prey. Elias felt something cold settle into his gut. He could stay still. Let it happen. Save himself. Or he could do something. And without another thought, Elias lunged. The chittering grew louder. A deep, resonant hum vibrated through the ruins, a signal spreading through the hive. They were coming. More of them. Elias's mind raced, calculating, measuring every possibility. Running wasn't an option, not with Carrax in this state. Fighting was suicide. That left one option: disappear. He crouched beside the lifeless drone, his fingers pressing into the still warm ichor pooling beneath it. He grabbed a handful of the thick, translucent fluid and smeared it across his chest, then across his face. It was still hot sand, ticky as it seeped into the fabric of his suit. His stomach churned. Carrax let out a strained breath. "You've lost your mind." "Lost it years ago," Elias muttered, dragging another handful of the ichor across his arms. He turned to Carrax, who was pale, and without hesitation, Elias reached out and smeared the same substance across the Dornathian's chest. Carrax recoiled, eyes wide with disgust. "This is brilliant," Elias finished for him. "Zerkal don't attack their own unless provoked. If we smell like them, they'll pass us by. Hopefully." Carrax gave him a hard look. "Hopefully?" Elias shrugged. "Science in action, my friend." The ground trembled beneath them. The first shadow appeared through the smoke, tall, multi-limbed mandibles flexing as it moved with eerie precision. Another followed. Then another. A dozen figures, their pale carapaces gleaming in the low light, spreading out, scanning the battlefield. Elias straightened, keeping Carrax propped against his side. "Move slow," he whispered. "Don't look at them. Don't run. Just walk." The Dornathian swallowed hard but nodded. Together, they stepped forward. The first drone twitched at the movement, its glossy black eyes locking onto them. Elias fought the instinct to freeze. He kept walking, matching the rhythm of the creatures around them, moving with a purpose that wasn't entirely his own. Carrax was rigid against him, his breathing controlled but shallow. Another drone clicked its mandibles and turned away. Then another. They weren't reacting. Elias kept his steps steady, forcing his muscles to remain loose, to act as though nothing was wrong. Just another day, just another 2 drones returning from a hunt. A cold bead of sweat trailed down his spine. 10 feet. 5. The drones moved around them, unbothered. Elias's pulse spiked. His head snapped toward the sound. Further down the ruins, one of the fallen soldiers, still alive, barely. The Zircal had noticed. A scout lunged forward, its limbs moving in a blur, mandibles closing around the soldier's throat before he could even scream. Carrax tensed, his body trembling with rage, his fingers twitching toward his belt where his weapon would have been. Elias's grip on his arm tightened. "Not yet," he murmured under his breath. Carrax's jaw clenched, but he didn't move. They kept walking. Elias exhaled, only now realizing he had been holding his breath. He glanced at Carrax. "See? What did I tell you? Science." Carrax didn't answer. He only looked back at the battlefield, at the place where his fellow soldiers had been left behind, and then at the man who had just led him straight into the heart of the enemy's domain. Without another word, they stepped into the dark. The deeper they moved into the tunnels, the heavier the air became, thick, humid, laced with a scent that made Elias's stomach churn. It was a mix of decay and something else, something alive, something that slithered beneath the surface of perception like a whisper in the dark. The walls pulsed faintly, slick with a bioluminescent secretion that bathed everything in an eerie green glow. Elias kept his grip firm on Carrax, steadying him as they navigated the uneven ground. The Dornathian was moving better now. He was silent, which Elias appreciated. Any noise could draw attention. The Zircal could communicate through pheromones, but they weren't deaf. Any misplaced sound and this disguise wouldn't save them. They passed clusters of worker drones, their spindly bodies moving in synchronized, mindless labor, sealing walls with mucus, tending to freshly laid eggs that pulsed faintly. Each one of those eggs held a larva, waiting to hatch, waiting to feed. A low, clicking hum resonated through the tunnels. Elias slowed his pace, glancing at Carrax. The Dornathian's expression was unreadable, but his hands were clenched tight. His breathing controlled. He was listening, too. The sound was coming closer. Elias shifted subtly. Not that it would help. If they were discovered here, in the depths of the hives, they wouldn't let us go. A warrior drone emerged from the shadows ahead. It was larger than the workers, taller than both of them. Its carapace a deeper shade of red, its eyes like polished obsidian. It clicked once, scanning the area. Elias forced himself to breathe evenly, act natural. He let his shoulders sag slightly, mimicking the drones around him. Carrax mirrored his movements, though Elias could feel the tension coiled in every muscle of the alien's frame. The warrior took a step closer, another. Elias's fingers twitched, ready to move, to do something. But then the drone turned. It skittered past them, deeper into the tunnels. He exhaled slowly, his heart hammering in his ribs. Carrax whispered, barely audible. "How much farther?" Elias surveyed the tunnel. The glow of the walls stretched ahead in an endless, twisting path. His only guide was a flickering navigation display on the remains of his wrist.
Device, damaged in the crash, but still holding enough power to provide a rough layout of the area.
They were close to their target. "The spaceport should be another 2 clicks down," he murmured. "Through the lower chambers." Carrax's expression darkened. "The incubation pits." Elias grimaced. He had hoped he was wrong. The incubation pits were where the Zircal kept their fresh hosts, bodies still alive, suspended in mucus-lined cells, waiting for the moment the larvae would hatch and burrow inside. It was the last stop. If there were any other survivors from the battle, that's where they would be. A flicker of movement caught Elias's eye. Further down the tunnel, a figure against the wall, bound in the same cocoon-like resin as the rest of the hive structures. A soldier, human, still alive. Carrax saw it too. His jaw tightened. Elias moved before he could think, keeping his steps silent as he approached. The soldier's face was barely visible through the hardened mucus. His chest rose and fell, weak but steady. His eyes flickered open, glassy with exhaustion, and locked onto Elias. Elias reached for his weapon. Carrax said, "If you cut structure, he will scream." Elias's jaw clenched. He knew Carrax was right. The shock of sudden movement, the soldier wouldn't be able to stay quiet. The whole hive would hear. The soldier's lips moved. A whisper. Weak. Help me. Elias's grip on his weapon tightened. Karrak spoke low. Urgent. We do not have time. Elias closed his eyes for a brief moment. He wasn't leaving anyone behind. Not again. His gaze darted to the structure of the hive around them, the waxy resin holding the soldier in place. He wasn't just trapped, he was preserved. The Zirkal were keeping him alive for a reason. If Elias freed him now, he would die. But if they came back? A plan took shape. It was reckless, dangerous, but it was something. He turned to Karrax. We come back for him. The Dornathian frowned. What? Elias wasn't sure why, but he trusted his gut on this. He leaned closer to the soldier, pressing a hand lightly to his shoulder. Stay awake, he murmured. Stay quiet. I promise we'll be back. The soldier's breathing was uneven, but his eyes focused. He understood. Elias turned, pulling Karrax with him. There was no time for argument, no time for second-guessing. If they wanted a real chance at saving anyone, they needed to get to the spaceport. Now. They moved quickly, weaving through the tunnels, past more workers tending to their grotesque duties. The farther they went, the heavier the air became. Then, just ahead, the tunnel widened. A massive chamber yawned open before them, its ceiling vanishing into darkness. And at the center, a cluster of massive organic sacs, each one pulsing with the slow, methodical rhythm of something breathing inside. Karrax whispered, horrified. The Queen's chamber. Elias exhaled. Yeah, we just walked into the last place we want to be. A shape moved above them. A shadow titanic, glistening. A mass of limbs and armor and ancient intelligence. And then the eyes turned toward them. They had been seen. Her core. Karrax shouted something warning. Panic. But Elias wasn't listening. He axed. The Queen screamed, a psychic howl that shattered the pheromone link controlling the hive. The drones staggered, their movements breaking into a wild, chaotic frenzy. The Queen collapsed, her enormous form convulsing, ichor spraying in thick, steaming waves. The hive was collapsing. Elias didn't wait to see what happened next. He grabbed Karrax by the arm and ran. The drones' minds are thrown into disarray. The tunnels shook, sections of the ceiling caving in as the biological structures that held the hive together failed. They reached the ship, barely intact, barely operational, but still standing. Elias slammed the controls, overriding the security locks, the engines sputtering as they roared to life. Karrax threw himself into the co-pilot seat. Tell me you know how to fly this thing. Elias grinned as he punched the thrusters. Define no. Mate. The ship lurched as they pulled free from the hive. The Queen's body vanished into the implosion. As they broke the atmosphere, Elias leaned back in his seat, exhaling. Karrax stared at him. Elias raised a brow. Told you we wouldn't, problem. Karrax let out something between a laugh and a groan of pure exhaustion. Elias smirked. So, next time, you want to listen to the human before we get chased by a hive? Karrax only shook his head, and against the backdrop, Elias laughed. The stars stretched endlessly before them, cold and indifferent. The engines sputtered but held, carrying them away from the dying planet below. Dorgus V was breaking apart, its surface collapsing inward as the hive devoured itself in chaos. Fires raged across the wastelands, and the last remnants of the Zirkal stronghold crumbled into nothing. The war for this planet was over. Not one survived. Elias let his head rest against the seat, staring at the flickering console in front of him. The ship was barely holding together. Shields were at 8%. Fuel was a gamble, and if the hyperdrive didn't explode on ignition, it would be a miracle. But for now, for this one moment, they were alive. Karrax sat beside him, silent. The Dornathian's body was tense, his hands still gripping the edge of the console. But the fight was over. No more running. Elias let out a long breath and smirked. You look like you just saw your ancestors, buddy. Karrax exhaled sharply, shaking his head. You are impossible. Elias chuckled, stretching his arms, a sharp reminder of how close they had come to not making it out at all. He had faced difficulties before, countless times, but never like this. His grin faded slightly as his thoughts circled back to the soldier, the one they had left behind. His fingers moved over the controls, bringing up a crude scan of the surface. Karrax noticed the shift in his focus. We are barely holding together. We need to reach the fleet before— We're going back, Elias interrupted. Carrax stared at him. That would be suicide. Elias shrugged. So was walking into a hive. And yet, here we are. The Dornathian's mandibles clicked in frustration. Elias tapped the console. Sensors show movement. Heat signatures. Small. Scattered. But alive. He turned to Carrax. That means survivors. Carrax was silent for a long moment. Then he closed his eyes, exhaling slowly. You humans, you do not let go, do you? Elias grinned. Nope. The ship groaned in protest as he adjusted their course. The engines were fighting him, the hull barely holding together. But it didn't matter. He had made a promise. And if there was even the slightest chance that someone down there was still breathing, he wasn't leaving them behind. The descent was rough, violent. Alarms blared as the ship tore through the upper atmosphere, pushing past the smoke and ash lingering from the destruction below. The once mighty hive was a graveyard, its twisted spires reduced. They skimmed low over the ruined battlefield, past tunnels. Elias's grip tightened on the controls. There, among the wreckage, a cluster of heat signatures, weak but undeniable. Carrax saw it too. They're alive. Elias grinned. Told you. The ship touched down rough, kicking up dust. Elias was already moving before the engines powered down, grabbing what little medical supplies remained and forcing the hatch open. The survivors were barely conscious, their bodies covered in the hardened resin of the hive, but they were alive. The soldier Elias had seen earlier was among them. His eyes flickered open, disoriented. But when he saw Elias, something clicked in his gaze. You came back, the soldier rasped. Elias smirked, hauling him up. Told you I would. The rescue was quick but efficient. Every second spent on the ground was another second closer to something worse finding them. The Dornathian didn't say it, but Elias knew. He understood now. They barely made it back into orbit before the ship's systems gave out completely. The hyperdrive flickered, sputtered, and then, against all odds, it worked. The stars stretched, and the ship lurched into the void. Silence filled the cabin. Elias let himself breathe. Carrax sat across from him, exhausted but thoughtful. The survivors were stable, resting in the back of the ship. The mission was over, but something had changed. The Dornathian studied him for a long moment before speaking. You humans, you do not fight like warriors. His voice was quiet, almost reverent. You fight like something else, something I do not have words for. Elias raised a brow. That a compliment? Carrax exhaled, shaking his head. It is a warning. Elias laughed, leaning back against the wall. Well, I'll take it anyway. Outside the viewport, the void stretched endlessly, vast and unforgiving. The war wasn't over. The Zirkal were still out there. But something was different now. Humanity had left its mark, and the galaxy would never be the same again.